All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive historical shockwave, one that still reverberates globally right now. We're going to trace things back to a very specific moment where millions of lives were completely turned upside down, literally by the stroke of a pencil. We're looking at how a unified nation was torn apart overnight, completely without the consent of a single citizen.
Seriously, just imagine waking up tomorrow morning to find out your entire country has been fractured. There was no public vote, no grand treaty, no warning whatsoever. Just a sudden, staggering division imposed by complete strangers. Millions of people essentially lost their homeland overnight because of this arbitrary midnight decision.
Part 1. The Midnight Nap. To really grasp this ultimate geopolitical butterfly effect, we have to recognize that Korea wasn't split by some ancient, simmering civil feud. Not at all. We're talking about 5,000 years of unified, shared history. They had one common language and a single royal dynasty, but they were divided suddenly, right at midnight, simply because ordinary people got caught in the collision of superpowers. This was all about collapsing empires and Cold War politics that everyday Koreans had absolutely zero control over. Let's move to Part 2. A stolen independence.
So, this is where the tragic irony really hits hard. Back in 1910, the expanding Japanese empire formally annexed Korea, and for the next 35 long years, the Korean language, their culture, and really any form of resistance were violently suppressed. Then, finally, in August 1945, Japan suddenly collapses following the atomic bombs and a massive Soviet invasion. And here's the tragedy. Koreans spent 35 years fiercely fighting for their stolen independence, only to have it snatched right back away from them the exact moment World War II ended.
Which brings us to Part 3, the 30-minute decision.
Picture this. It's August 1945, and Washington is in an absolute logistical panic. Soviet troops are pouring into the northern part of Korea, and the closest U.S. forces, they're hundreds of miles away in Okinawa. So working late on August 10th, two exhausted U.S. officers, Colonels Dean Rusk and Charles Bonisteel, who, by the way, lacked any deep expert knowledge of Korean geography, make a monumental decision. They used an ordinary, commercial, National Geographic wall map to divide an entire country, and they did it in under 30 minutes.
So, why the number 38? Well, they hurriedly picked the 38th parallel simply because it was an administratively convenient line of latitude. It basically kept the capital city, Seoul, safely in the American zone. But here is the most crucial detail of this whole explainer. They intended this solely as a temporary, practical measure just to accept the Japanese surrender. It was absolutely never meant to be a permanent border.
Part 4. The divide hardens.
In literally a matter of months, that quote-unquote temporary line calcified. Suddenly, Koreans found themselves involuntarily enrolled in two completely opposing political experiments. Up in the Soviet-administered North, they backed a communist guerrilla named Kim Il-sung, modeling a society entirely on Soviet-style socialism. Meanwhile, in the U.S.-administered South, they backed an anti-communist exile, Syngman Rhee, to build a U.S.-style anti-communist state. That's two totally opposite visions, forced onto one unified people.
Now, it's important to know that peaceful reunification was genuinely attempted. Between 1946 and 1947, joint U.S.-Soviet negotiations took place to form a unified government. But intense Cold War distrust absolutely doomed them. By 1947, the U.S. proposes nationwide UN elections, but the Soviets refuse to allow observers in the North. So by 1948, separate elections are held anyway. This officially created two rival governments, with both sides claiming they were the rightful rulers of the entire peninsula.
And then the tension just explodes. On June 25, 1950, the North invades the South, using Soviet tanks with Stalin's tacit approval. The United Nations, led by the U.S., immediately intervenes to support the South. But as U.S. forces push northward toward the border, China enters the fray about the North. What followed was 3 utterly brutal years of a devastating conflict that swept back and forth, turning the peninsula into a massive Cold War battlefield and reducing once thriving cities to absolute rubble.
2 to 3 million. Let that number sink in for a second. That staggering figure represents the estimated casualties from the war. And the vast majority of those lost were innocent civilians, who were simply caught in the crossfire of a massive global standoff.
By 1953, the fighting grinds to a brutal stalemate right around that original 38th parallel. This creates the Korean Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ.
Now, ironically, despite the name, it is actually one of the most heavily fortified and militarized strips of land on the entire planet. And because no formal peace treaty was ever signed, just an armistice, North and South Korea technically remain at war to this very day.
Which leads us into our final section, Part 5, A Legacy of Division. Let's clear up some common misconceptions here, because understanding the facts is absolutely crucial to grasping modern geopolitics. A huge myth is that the country was split by ancient internal rivalries, when in reality, it was entirely imposed by foreign superpowers. Another myth, that the line was chosen with careful strategic reasoning. Nope, it was hurriedly picked on a commercial map in 30 minutes. And maybe the biggest myth of all is that Koreans organically demanded this division. The truth is, they were completely excluded from the decision.
If you look at the peninsula today, the massive divergence caused by that single pencil stroke is just wild. On one side, you have modern Seoul, a hyper-modern technology hub, a booming leading economy, and a massive cultural exporter. Think K-pop. Then, right across the border, modern Pyongyang is defined by extreme isolation, a focus on nuclear weapons development, and a closed state ruled tightly by a single family for generations. It is one people, but two entirely divergent universes. But beyond all the high-level geopolitics, the deepest tragedy remains the human cost. We're talking about separated families, siblings, parents, and children who haven't seen each other in over 70 years. They are now in their 80s and 90s, relying on incredibly rare, tightly controlled border reunions. And tragically, they are quite literally running out of time. So, I'll leave you with this final thought to chew on. Just look at how profoundly a 30-minute choice, scribbled on a borrowed map, has echoed across generations. It forces us to ask, how quickly can a totally temporary decision, made under intense pressure by people who barely understand the ground reality, calcify into a permanent reality that outlives us all? It's a pretty sobering reminder of how history is made, isn't it?